Final Fantasy III is a regression of sorts. Gone is the more realistic plot of empires and rebellions. 3 features a return to crystals and warriors of light. Magic points disappear in favor of the spell slot system from the first game and Dungeons & Dragons. Like Final Fantasy I, the plot sends us from place to place without letting us really get to know any of those places or the characters in them. That's not to say there are no innovations. Since the game's creators weren't as focused on a plot that makes sense, they were free to design dungeons that were more compact and fun. And since there were more areas, those dungeons could be shorter, with much more time between random encounters. This game also marks the first to show Final Fantasy's inclusions of secrets. There's nothing as convoluted as Final Fantasy VII's Knight of the Nine summon, but every area has several secret walls or switches that open to treasure. There's even a few secret summons to get, like Odin, who I did find, and Bahamut, who I did not. And 3 is the first of the series to introduce Moogles, a Final Fantasy staple. I love them. I think most fans of Final Fantasy know 3's biggest innovation, though, whether they've actually played or not: the job system. Each of your 4 characters has access to several jobs. At the start, there's only a few choices, but by the end, you'll have 22 jobs to choose from. It's an interesting system that I think is more of a gimmick, unfortunately. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad it exists, as it gave Square a good base for future games. But here, there's a lot of jobs that don't really offer anything worthwhile outside of a highly specified situation. A boss who changes weaknesses that you can scan using the Scholar's Study ability, or just use the White Mage's Libra spell. Areas that you can only reach using the White Mage's Mini and Toad spells. A boss who's especially weak to the Dragoon's Jump ability. And that last one shows just how little thought they put into actually utilizing the different jobs. But in order to explain, I have to give a spoiler warning. As you'll see, I don't think there's much to spoil in Final Fantasy III's story, except for maybe the end, but I will be talking about a few important story moments, including the finale. As you explore Sardonia, a war-torn city whose king recently decided he didn't like to rule over living people, you hear whispers of Garuda, who is especially weak to dragoons. You find Prince Alice in a bar, and he joins your party for a bit to confront the king. In what is probably the game's longest cutscene, except for a couple towards the end, you're brought into the castle and told to sleep the night until the king meets with you in the morning. As you sleep, the king attempts to kill his son, Alice, and it's revealed that he is under the control of his minister, Gigametz. Gigametz is actually Garuda. But you don't find that out until the end of the cutscene when you're forced into a battle with him. So unless you looked up a walkthrough and knew what was going to happen, you're almost forced to lose once, then reload your save, watch the cutscene again, and then attempt the fight again, but this time with 3 dragoons in your party to make short work of him. It's fine that a boss is weak to a specific job type, but I'm baffled at this implementation of it. Otherwise, there are some interesting jobs to play around with, but I started the game with a warrior, monk, white mage, and black mage, and ended with a knight, ninja, devout, and magus, which are basically promoted versions of the original classes, another regression back to the first Final Fantasy. Technically, the ninja was the promoted version of the thief, but they're similar enough, I think. At least this time, you can change your job at any point if you want to. So I'm sure there's a good challenge here for anyone who wants to figure out the most overpowered party composition. But for someone who just wants to play the game, there's not really a good reason to stray from the normal party composition. There are some abilities that are somewhat interesting, but only in the, oh, that's kinda cool way, not in the, ooh, that's useful way. Also, there's both character levels and job levels, and I never really understood what the job levels did. I had to look it up after I beat the game, and apparently it increases attacks for physical classes, and increases the effectiveness of spells, but I never really had any issues with damage output when I switched jobs. By far the best thing the game does is the final dungeons. In Final Fantasy II, the goal seemed to be to create a long, grueling experience with a hefty amount of RNG to add length and artificial difficulty. But in 3, there was thought put into the experience. Before you enter Circus Tower, effectively the final dungeon, you have to fight Doga and Une. 2 allies who, nevertheless, need to fight you for energy to create the key to the tower. Or something, it doesn't make sense, but it is a DPS check. If you can defeat Doga and Une, you can beat the game. I actually made an attempt and got my ass handed to me, forcing me to grind quite a bit. The circumstances behind the grind are actually somewhat tied to the job system. There's a dungeon right before the area where you fight Doga and Une, where the enemies multiply if you hit them with swords, which gets pretty annoying since the actual multiplication takes a while and can be never-ending. You can cast offensive spells to avoid this, or use katanas. I could have changed a couple characters to Dark Knights to use katanas, but couldn't be bothered. Instead, I just ran from every battle, and in the process probably didn't level up enough to be prepared for Doga and Une. Anyway, after a good amount of grinding, probably too much, but I wanted to be sure, I fought Doga and Une again and beat them this time. I wasn't expecting it, but the designers actually thought this through. I don't actually know this, but it seems well thought out. In Circus Tower, and Eureka if you want the weapons, which I definitely did, you come face to face with Xandi, a villain you've heard of, but never seen. After you fight him, you're forced into the World of Darkness, the actual final dungeon. There's no way to leave, and you're forced to fight your way to the final boss, the Cloud of Darkness. There are 4 mini-bosses on the way, and each spawns a crystal that resurrects any fallen party members and heals all your hit points and magic uses. This allows the bosses to feel appropriately epic in a way that was severely lacking in Final Fantasy II. The final dungeon isn't about wearing you down over countless floors, and there's no gotchas like the curls in Final Fantasy II that could kill your party outright if you were ambushed. The World of Darkness instead asks you to use what you've learned to fight some of the toughest battles the game has to offer, and the Cloud of Darkness is especially memorable. I don't think the original version allowed any saves in dungeons, so this may have been a little frustrating on release, but I think it works regardless. You might spend a lot more time in a single session in the final dungeon, but the rules are the same as they were 30 years ago. Apply what you've learned, use all your tools, and you'll get through it. It's a marvel of mechanics that could easily be taken for granted in today's games, but it's an early example of a game that tested your abilities fairly, and it's all the better for it. The final dungeon also recontextualizes what you've been doing all game. The plot of the game has you going from area to area collecting new key items without really allowing you to get comfortable in any one place. It moves extremely quickly, which is a refreshing change after 2, but you also never really get to know any of the characters who join you for short stretches. You accomplish your goal and are immediately off after the next goal. But before you reach Xandi, you're trapped by a magic mirror, forced to wait while 5 worms wake up, eager to turn you into a meal. However, the souls of Doga and Une gather your allies, Sarah, Desh, Alice, Cid, and Othello, who fend off the worms and allow you to proceed to Xandi. Then, after defeating Xandi, you're faced with the Cloud of Darkness, who defeats you without flinching. You can't hurt her, and she wipes your party in a single attack, but the souls of Doga and Une lend you their power to revive you and open the path to the World of Darkness. And it's here I realized that I wasn't just gathering items as I traveled the world. I was making friends and allies. Without those friends, my party would be dead at the top of Circus Tower, but they gave me the strength I needed to keep pushing forward and save the world. Before this, I was saving the world because that's what a hero in a JRPG does. The game really doesn't bother with explaining why you're special. It seems like you're chosen simply because you're the ones who found the cave with the crystal at the beginning of the game. That simple coincidence sets off a chain of events you're basically forced into. The game keeps telling you the world's in danger, but there's nothing you see that reinforces this. Sure, the world beneath the initial floating continent was flooded centuries ago, but that doesn't translate to an immediate threat to your world today. But at the top of Circus Tower, it finally becomes real. It's the very definition of too little too late, but it still has impact because it's unexpected. It's certainly not earned, and today would register as a last-ditch effort to inject some gravity into the otherwise lackluster story, but nevertheless, it still made me change my mind about the game. Even more so in the World of Darkness, where the 4 mini-bosses you fight are holding the long-lost warriors of darkness captive. And because you free them, they use their powers to weaken the Cloud of Darkness, enough for you to defeat her. I also appreciate this subversion of our tendency to use the idea of darkness as evil. The world needs darkness and light, and in Final Fantasy III, the warriors who represent both of these aspects join together to save the world. It's not perfect, and it takes way too long to get to this point, But the end of Final Fantasy III made me change my tune on what I was going to call the first in the series that I didn't really like. Now, I can admit that I do like it, but more for the future of Final Fantasy it represents. I've been looking forward to playing Final Fantasy IV for the first time, and my experience with 3 just whetted my appetite. Or I don't know, maybe I just loved hearing this iteration of the Circus Tower music, which I fell in love with in Final Fantasy XIV's version. It's been great seeing the beginning of the ideas that would become ubiquitous in later Final Fantasy games. I can't say it's always been fun, but it has definitely been worthwhile, and I'm happy to have finally experienced the original trilogy. My own Final Fantasy journey began with Final Fantasy VI, but I've always heard that 4 is truly excellent. So it's finally time to dive into the Super Nintendo era. Thank you for watching.